United Airlines to try to keep us from moving this. Let's get our panel here. We've got one of our panelists. Do we have the other two?
Chris Fair. I know she was standing.
Christine Fair and Nir Rosen. Nir Rosen immediately up here. Nir Rosen immediately up here. I also want to say that while this next panel focuses on Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan, Karen Greenberg and the Center on Law and Security at New York University will have a conference 1 week from today in New York at NYU on the subject of Afghanistan and many of these similar issues. So I want to encourage those watching on C-SPAN Live, watching on the Washington Note at the American Strategist. That program, we hope, will also be webcast live 1 week from today on October 17th. Okay, I'm going to turn the panel over now to Peter Bergen. Do you have two other panelists or not?
Chris Fair.
Is Chris Fair or Seth Jones here?
Yes.
It would help to have the folks up here. Christine Fair? Great, right here, Chris. Let me give a round of applause and thank Peter Bergen again for helping to design this magnificent conference, which is an update of Al-Qaeda 2.0 4 years ago. Now Peter Bergen.
Thank you, Stephen. This panel, Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we just heard an excellent panel. I think the gentleman was correct not to characterize it as the war of ideas, but perhaps a competition of ideas. It seems in that competition, Islam will defeat Al-Qaeda before the United States will. And perhaps as a sort of jumping-off point for this discussion, well, let me just introduce first our panelists. We have the best panelists possible on this subject. Nir Rosen called me a few months ago saying, I'm going to go in bed with the Taliban. And I was like, Nir, have you noticed all these journalists are being beheaded when they're in bed with the Taliban? I mean, that was like somewhat kind of crazy idea 18 months ago, but it's really crazy right now. Nir, of course, ignored my advice. Obviously he survived. He also has been doing groundbreaking work not only with the Taliban in Afghanistan, but also with Al-Qaeda members in Lebanon, many of whom are Iraq War veterans. Nir speaks fluent Arabic. I can pretty sure in the history of the New Yorker, or the history of journalism, Nir went from being a bouncer at a Washington, D.C. nightclub to being a writer at the New Yorker with no intervening stages. And he wrote a brilliant book about being inside the Iraqi insurgency, inside the belly of the Green Bird. He is one of the leading experts on Islamist militants around the world. To his right, Christine Fair speaks Punjabi, speaks Urdu, has done the best work, in my view, on the Pakistani madrasas, took a very skeptical view about the Pakistani madrasas, saying, wait a minute, let's look at Pakistani public schools. They seem to be graduating more terrorists than the madrasas. I think I'm correct in characterizing that. Also, Christine was the lead author of the excellent report on the suicide bombers in Afghanistan. Her most recent work, and perhaps in some senses her most important, is the cookbook that she has just written, which I urge you to read. Cuisines are the Axis of Evil and Other Irritating States. It's not only hilariously funny, but it actually works. The Iraqi salad is pretty good, and other recipes in there. Both Seth Jones, to my right, and Christine Fair, of course, work at RAND. Nir Rosen works both at NYU and New America. Seth Jones, I think, has done the best work on the insurgency in Afghanistan. He's embedded multiple times with the various NATO allies in Afghanistan. He's got a forthcoming book coming out, Graveyard of Empires, about Afghanistan. He just did an excellent report for RAND on the counterinsurgency strategy that we need in Afghanistan. So an excellent panel. Seth will kick things off.
Thank you, Peter, and it's an honor to be here. And Peter, I apologize. You had to slog through my manuscript, so kudos to you for providing comments. What I want to do is ask and at least begin to answer three questions. One is, who are the Taliban and other groups? What are their goals? Essentially, what are their similarities and differences? and what is their relationship to Al-Qaeda. Most of this work is based on my work in the field over the last couple of years, including this year a couple of times to the border regions, all the way up from the Kunar border down into as far south as Kandahar, Spin Boldak. And then also, as Peter noted, a lot of this is being written up for a book that comes out in a few months from Norton on In the Graveyard of Empires, America's War in Afghanistan. What I want to do is begin by looking for a second at this, the word that people often use to describe who the U.S. and its NATO allies are fighting in Afghanistan and who many in Pakistan refer to as well is the Taliban. I find this a rather unhelpful term, and I'll tell you why in a second. Because I actually think when you get on the ground and you begin to look at the organizations one is dealing with, what you find is something that's perhaps more accurately described as a complex adaptive system. And what that means is a system that's diverse, that is made up of multiple interconnected nodes, and it's adaptive in the sense that it possesses the capacity to change and learn, especially across regions. So in my view, when we talk about Taliban or even other groups, I'm going to divide that into about 6 different categories, and one could further subdivide them. The first are a range of militant groups, including Mullah Omar's Taliban, which is based primarily in the area of Quetta, Pakistan. You also get a range of other groups, even on the Afghan side, or at least that are fighting on the Afghan side, the Haqqani network, especially Jalaluddin's son Siraj, a range of groups like Hezb Islami Khalis and Hezb Islami Gulbuddin, Hekmatchar's organization, which operate really on the northern parts in the Kunar, Nuristan, Nangarhar area, and then in the northwest frontier province in Bajor. Groups like TNSM, which operates in Bajor and north of Bajor and the tribal agencies. A couple of groups that have moved into this front over the last year or two, particularly Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba. This list could go on, including, I'm going to leave aside the whether to call him the former or the current Baitullah Masood, since it appears to be some debate even within the intelligence community about whether he's still with us or not. But as you see, there are a range of different groups, and I've just hit a couple of them. And even within those, we see, even with the TTP, for example, you get a range of different groups. You get Lashkar-e-Islami, you get Ansar Islam, you're getting parts of TNSM as well. So you really get a range of groups. You're also getting a whole range of tribes and sub-tribes and clans. This is a second category. Again, whether it's on the Pakistani side, whether it's the Masouds of South Waziristan Agency or the Wazirs, both South and North Waziristan Agency, and a range of different tribes, sub-tribes, and clans. You're also getting political parties. On the Pakistani side, you're of course getting the JI and the JUI. You're getting a range of militia commanders on the ground. You're getting a range of criminal organizations, anything from the drug trafficking organizations that exist in Baluchistan and southern Helmand province, as well as gem, timber, and other illicit trafficking that goes on in eastern Afghanistan and then in parts of Pakistan across the border. And then, of course, you're getting state or government agencies involved. And again, on the Afghan side, you clearly have gotten Afghan National Police involved in cooperating with Taliban. We saw in the attack in Wanat in Nuristan that the local district governor was actually involved in assisting the attack on the American outpost. We see on the Pakistani side, we see, of course, concerns about Frontier Corps. There's been direct engagement between the U.S. military and Frontier Corps. ISI, the Army itself, and then, of course, Iran, its Quds Force, and a range of other organizations. So you have at least 6 different categories, within them subgroups and groupings. And so the point here is that when you get into villages and districts, either on the Afghan or the Pakistani side, how these entities come together actually varies quite a bit. So in some places you may get relationships between Mullah Omar's Taliban groups, local sub-tribes, and criminal organizations. What happens closer to Waziristan is somewhat different. But it clearly is, in my view, a locally based insurgency. To paraphrase what Tip O'Neill said about American politics, all politics in this region is local, or is primarily local. So I think calling this a Taliban is actually really is a failure to understand, and this has serious implications for how one responds, is a failure to understand what really is going on. So if I move to some of the goals and the nuances of what we might call Taliban, I think there clearly are even divisions within some of these groups. We see divisions on the ground. And let me first say, by the way, that even Omar's Taliban is a fundamentally different organization today than what it was in the 1990s in a range of ways. First of all, it does not have, even if it had some sort of command and control over the insurgency in the 1990s, and there are arguments there, not now in my view. I mean, the inner shura is still located in the area of Quetta, and there are regional shuras in places like Waziristan and Peshawar, but it does not have that sort of command and control that it may have had a decade ago. So again, you're getting a loosely knit patchwork of militant groups, tribes, sub-tribes, clans, criminal organizations, state agencies, etc. And they really have, in my view, and we don't have time at this point to go through all of the objectives of these organizations and groupings, but they have, in many ways, very different objectives, some broader in scope. We'll get to Al-Qaeda in a second, some much more narrow and parochial in scope, including, for example, Gulbuddin Hekmatchar's Hezb Islami. There are divisions within some of these organizations. For example, there are recent indications from the ground that Maulvi Nazir of South Waziristan and some of his, some others from both South and North Waziristan have become, have actually begun to at least form a bloc. It's probably too early to tell how significant this over a long run to defend the Wazir tribe's interests in North Waziristan Agency and South Waziristan Agency, especially against some of the Masouds. And part of this appears to be Nasir still holds a grudge against Masoud for sheltering Uzbek militants that have been pushed out of, that were pushed out of some of the Wazir areas. The point, and as we look at a range of these groups that some collectively call Taliban, but I think is rather unhelpful, there clearly are splits between many, if not most of them. I mean, there are some similarities. We can get to those in the question and answer session. But I wanted to finish by spending a little bit of time on the connection between some of these groups and Al-Qaeda. And let me first say that as in the 1990s, in my view, on the ground, there have always been some tensions and some ideological differences between many of these groups we've just talked about and Al-Qaeda, especially Al-Qaeda based in the in areas of Pakistan. This is not just in North or South Waziristan Agency or Bajor, but of course in Baluchistan and a range of other areas where they're located. Al-Qaeda has utilized support from some local militants for its outer perimeter security, but there still is, for example, there appears to be in some areas Al-Qaeda fighters look very disdainfully on the masses of some of the local Pashtun militants. And many of these local militants view Al-Qaeda as unwelcome foreigners. I mean, it's impossible to generalize, but there clearly are tensions in various ways. There have been tensions over the use of suicide attacks. And as Chris has noted really better than anybody on the Unama, Taliban in particular have been quite mediocre, I think, at their use of, in their use of suicide attacks. But there are links between Al-Qaeda and several of these groups, including Mullah Omar's Taliban, based again out of Baluchistan, the Haqqani network, which is based out of Waziristan, and some of the foreign fighters, including some of the Uzbeks. So there is, in my view, there is clearly a link, and actually I would even go as far as saying that the links at the strategic, the operational, and the tactical level are actually closer than they were during the 1990s. In my view, Al-Qaeda is more involved in actual day-to-day military operations than it was during the 1990s. Well, what does that mean? I will outline a couple of ways in which Al-Qaeda is involved. And the way I'm going to characterize it is, if you remember this, these commercials from a few years ago from the German-based chemical giant BASF. They ran these commercials which said, we don't make a lot of the products you buy, but we make a lot of the products you buy better. I mean, that's the way I would actually characterize what al-Qaeda has done in this area, is they've improved the tactical and operational competence of some of the local Afghan and Pakistan groups who were able to manufacture a range of better products, improvised explosive devices, for example, but don't play a major footprint on the ground. They clearly have, one of the things that's been interesting over the past year or so, I mean, there clearly are either al-Qaeda or some other Arabs or foreign fighters that have embedded the way, for example, a U.S. embedded training team embeds in Afghan National Army or Afghan National Police Forces. We have seen some embedding in local, whether it's Taliban or Haqqani Network or Hezbollah Islami forces or TNSM on the ground. There has been embedding by al-Qaeda, but they do not play a major role in ground operations, at least in my view. Where the Taliban, or where groups like al-Qaeda have also been quite instrumental, in my view, is on the media and propaganda efforts. I mean, the Taliban, for example, Omar Taliban, is a fundamentally different organization than they were in the 1990s on their use of propaganda. I mean, even before his death, people like Mullah Dadullah Lang appeared somewhat comfortable in front of a video camera, espousing his views. Again, you never would have seen that, at least in my view, anywhere near that sort of level during the 1990s. So in a range of areas, what I would argue is it is a even Omar's Taliban is a fundamentally different organization because of its relationship with al-Qaeda at a range of levels, including, for example, the use of suicide attacks. I mean, we saw one in 2001, 2 in 2002, 2 in 2003, 6 in 2004, and then you see this significant increase: 21 in 2005, 139 in 2006, 140 in 2007, and what appears to be an actually increase over 2007 and 2008. And one of the things I would attribute this to is Zawahiri, among others, pushing suicide attacks as a key tactic. Though, as Chris has pointed out, when it comes especially to Omar's Taliban, they've been rather ineffective at killing, at least compared to other areas. I'm going to finish up with 3 brief conclusions based on this. First is, I actually think that U.S., NATO, Afghan government, Pakistan government, or other organizations have to, and I'm going to use this term, defeat these groups, especially groups like the Taliban, for a range of reasons, killing or capturing especially senior levels of the organization. I think we cannot expect a serious settlement between senior members of these groups and whether it's the Afghan government or the Pakistan government. In my view, we didn't have a lot of time to discuss this, the visions are fundamentally different. Second, I actually strongly disagree with the argument pushed by Rory Stewart and others about conceding territory to the Taliban. I would argue that the links between Omar's Taliban and al-Qaeda are actually stronger than they were during the 1990s, and it would be fundamentally dangerous, which leads me to my third point, which is I think the issue is not trying to break al-Qaeda from groups like the Taliban. I think it's trying to split some of these groups from each other. There's been a history of fighting, for example, between Hezbollah Islami, Hekmatyar in particular, and Taliban, including a range of other groups. We see it actually along tribal lines, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think your issue is breaking some of these groups apart, or also separating supporters at the local level from the leadership structure, and that means in particular taking advantage of grievances. I mean, I would say support levels for groups like the Taliban still do not poll. They do not poll well. What they appear to do, including on Afghanistan, is they appear to be unhappy with their government. People don't appear to be particularly supportive of the Taliban itself. That means there may be ways, as was done in 2001 and 2002, to break tribes, sub-tribes, clans, and other local entities from the top tiers of the organization. So I'm going to conclude in that sense and hand this over.
Thank you very much, Seth. And now we'll hear from Dr. Christine Farr.
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the plug. I should say that the cookbook came about because of Peter Bergen, so we're doing a little bit of mutual back-scratching here. So my talk actually overlaps, I think, very nicely with Seth's. I'm going to be focusing my comments really on Pakistan, and in particular the relationship that that state has had and that it currently enjoys with a raft of militant groups based in and from its territory. I think we all know that for a long time, not since just 9/11, but in fact for several decades, Pakistan has been a place where a raft of militant groups have operated. But for a number of reasons, in particular following the events of 9/11, the salience of those groups and their capacity to imperil not only Pakistan's own security, but that of the international community have really become apparent. And the threat from Pakistan persists. Despite receiving some $11 billion or more, the money keeps increasing every month. Yet despite those subsidies, Pakistan is more insecure, not less, and the sanctuaries have expanded, not contracted. Now, what's very interesting to me, I've been following Pakistan for a number of years, and I think before 9/11, but certainly before 2004, you could with some precision sort of segment the militant market along a number of dimensions. You could, for example, look at their theater of operations and their targets. So you had those groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed that really focused upon Kashmir and India. You had the sectarian groups like Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Sipe-Sabe, Pakistan, that mostly focused upon killing Shia in Pakistan. And you could also divide them by their sectarian affiliation. Are they Deobandi? Are they Jamaat Islami aligned? Are they Ahl-e Hadith? Now, I would caution that even before 9/11, that was a fraught exercise, and people did it at their peril, at least in part because the Deobandi organizations, which span Jaish-e-Mohammed and the sectarian groups, always had overlapping membership with each other and with the political party JUI. And for I think a lot of analysts of South Asia, early on in the war on terrorism, we were very dismayed by the U.S. willingness to focus upon al-Qaeda while not focusing upon these Kashmiri groups. And I think we were concerned for a very straightforward reason. These Deobandi groups had actually been the al-Qaeda outsourcers in South Asia. So you look at the folks who were targeting the French engineers in Karachi, the Marriott attacks, those were actually Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, the sectarian groups that a very narrow but yet not a comprehensive understanding of the Pakistani militant terrain would suggest you could ignore. Since 2004, what was always a fraught exercise, I would argue, has become a dangerous exercise in terms of trying to segment the militant market, yet that is exactly what the Pakistani state is trying to do. There have been a number of really interesting alignments. Those groups that used to, for example, focus upon killing Shia have now relocated to FATA, where they target Pakistani targets, such as the military, the Frontier Corps. And we've also seen the development of new groups. Since 2004, and I cite that date in particular because that's when we saw the Pakistan Army move into South Waziristan. But I think the development of the phenomenon of the Pakistani Taliban may have begun before 2004. But by 2004, it was actually undeniable. Now, you can debate the characterization of that militant formation all along the tribal areas and, of course, the settled Pashtun areas of the Northwest Frontier Province. You can debate whether it's really unified under the current or perhaps deceased, the terrorist formerly known as Baytullah Masood. Okay, you guys don't apparently listen to Prince. In any event, you can debate what sort of structure exists amongst those groups, but you can't deny that there is a Pashtun social movement that has riven the tribal areas in the adjoining Northwest Frontier areas. And you can't deny that groups that used to be sectarian in focus are now doing what had never been heard of before 2006, and that's conducting suicide attacks against the Frontier Corps, the Army, the ISI, its erstwhile sponsor, as well as political leadership. This is absolutely unprecedented. Pakistan has also learned the hard way that what happens in FATA does not stay in FATA. So what we've seen, you guys, commercials, the Vegas thing, lunch, wake up, dudes. So it's true, what happens in FATA clearly has not stayed in FATA. mostly through their networks, their Pashtun networks and mosques and madrasas. The militant groups that may have their roots in Fatah have an uncanny ability to project into the settled areas. And so in retaliation for the Pakistani military operations against some militant groups, but clearly not all, you had a series of retaliatory strikes throughout the Pakistani heartland. And those linkages also go the other way around. It's not simply the problem in Fatah emanating outward. For those of you who watched the drama of the Lao Masjid unfold last summer, I want to point out that the Lao Masjid problem, it wasn't new. It had been a long-standing militant and ISI redoubt. In fact, my colleagues that wanted to go and get the latest Jaish-e-Mohammed Masouda's harm musing would go to the bazaar outside of the Lao Masjid and buy whatever DVDs were available, and there were many available. So this had been a long-standing asset that had really gone awry in various ways. But because of so many of the students that were eventually killed in that operation were actually from SWAT, the revolt that happened in SWAT actually occurred because of the events on Lao Masjid. And I think for people who watched the internal security dynamics of Pakistan develop, this was very unnerving, because not only do the problems radiate from Fatah, but in fact things that happen in the settled areas were able to exploit the militant infrastructure in those areas to reverberate in the other directions. What makes the Pakistani case so puzzling is that clearly the Pakistani military and armed forces are forward deployed. They are certainly taking casualties. Now, of course, they do like to note the body count as signs that there could be no, how shall we say, double game being played. But they certainly are forward deployed, and they are certainly killing some militant elements, namely the militant elements that harmed their domestic interests. The folks they're killing are, of course, not necessarily our high-value asset. And I am consistently amazed that journalists, many of whom we all know, have had the opportunity to interview Baytullah Masood, but ordnance has somehow not found its way to his cave. So this is very puzzling. The Pakistan Army, it's not just puzzling, it's disturbing. $13 billion later, we should expect Baytullah Masood to not be giving interviews to journalists working with the BBC. No slight on the BBC. They should be giving journalists from CNN interviews. But there are some very disturbing realities with the underbelly of this forward deployment. For a number of reasons, the Pakistan Army has preferred to use the Frontier Corps as the workhorse for the insurgency. The Frontier Corps, prima facie, for a person who doesn't know the region all that well, looks to be a good idea. They're generally recruited locally, they speak Pashto. So at first blush, when you read all the counterinsurgency literature that says local forces are the ones that defeat the bad guys, you check all the boxes with the Frontier Corps, except for one horrible problem. Historically, they were the ones that have been training militants in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And so it's not surprising then that over the last several years there have been an increasing frequency of leaks about Frontier Corps support to the Taliban. And these leaks have gotten increasingly brazen. Some of you may recall in June, we, the United States government, our armed forces actually bombed a Frontier Corps position, and the excuse for this was that they were actually firing on our troops. Now, while this was an incident that made the most flash in the news, I assure you that it was not an isolated event, that the problem with the Frontier Corps have been ongoing and they've been well known. And the U.S. government has tended to say that the Frontier Corps is not actively helping the Taliban. They've tended to justify working with the Frontier Corps, saying that they're poorly trained, they're poorly manned, they lack medical evacuation equipment, they feel let down by the Pakistan Army and they don't trust the Pakistan Army. All of these things are true, but elements of the Frontier Corps still help the Taliban. And this is an inescapable fact, and it's very difficult to square how this is the workhorse of the counterinsurgency when this is clearly a compromised workhorse. Now, I'm not going to paint the entire Frontier Corps with the same brush. Clearly, there are fellows who really are undertrained, they're poorly equipped, and they just want to get home at the end of their deployment. And if the Taliban wants to come screaming by in their Hilux, you know, they're going to do that. But we also can't be deluded that there are, in fact, active individuals in the Frontier Corps who are supporting the Taliban. There have also been, particularly this summer, very disturbing reports about the ISI actively supporting the Taliban. I think one of the more alarming reports was about the ISI involvement in the Indian bombing, the bombing of the Indian embassy in Kabul. This is all, of course, very disturbing news. So, you know, I'm a friend of Pakistan. I understand it's hard to reverse course, but we've got some real issues with this partner. And it's becoming very clear that while Pakistan has moderated the activities of some militants and while it's pursued al-Qaeda with some vigor, albeit under intense U.S. pressure, it doesn't appear as if Pakistan has strategically abandoned militancy as a tool in prosecuting its foreign policy objectives in India, Kashmir, or elsewhere. And these are the realities that riddle U.S.-Pakistan relations. What's also become very clear is that Pakistan itself has no real strategy. If you look at publications that describe the Pakistan Army's beliefs as well as Pakistani public opinion, they seem to be generally flummoxed about the nature of the problem that they confront. And you can sort of tweeze out two general strands. One strand is that we are coming under attack not because we've had 3 decades of supporting militancy in various guises and that this sort of is a classical blowback of proxies gone awry, but rather they're under attack because of their embrace of the United States. And if they back away from the U.S. and they forgo the policies that Washington wants them to pursue, they can restore the status quo ex ante. And some people look at Kiani's recent, that's the Chief of Army Staff, as some of his recent actions is really embodying that. He's backing away from COIN, counterinsurgency, he said as much. The evidence looks as if the spigots in Kashmir have opened in an effort to sort of restore the morale of the Pakistan Army and to basically diminish the rift that's occurred between the Army and the Pakistan people. On the other hand, there really are those that say we have a serious problem, and the policies of appeasement, of making peace deals with these various Taliban have really ceded Pakistan authority, and it's eroded the general Pakistani way of life. And certainly, if you talk to any of the women that were harassed in and around the Lal Masjid last year, that would certainly be an opinion that they would espouse. But even those people don't know how to go forward. If you look at Pakistani public opinion polls, Pakistanis don't fear al-Qaeda. Many Pakistanis don't even believe that al-Qaeda exists. And they're more likely to say that the United States is the biggest source of a threat to them than is al-Qaeda. So very clearly, the heart or the ballast of our efforts really need to be engaging Pakistanis, who really are going to be the ones that can bring Pakistan to the fight or not. And if you look at the last 7 years, we've had actually just the opposite policy. We've been pursuing the Army. It is the Army who actually has the conflicted objectives to support some aspects of militancy while fighting others. And we've done very little to support Pakistani civilian engagements. And I think I saw a time is up cue back there. So I'm going to wrap this up and sort of put on the table what is almost an impossible task. We know from the last 7 years that supporting the Army, supporting Army strong men, does not get us where we want to be. Musharraf may have done a good job at trying to sell the Army as a modernizing force, but no Army is a modernizing force for all of us who know armies. They're not the bastions of liberality in most countries. And Musharraf can't lead his people to have a belief about the war on terrorism when he himself has no credibility. There's been a lot of enthusiasm about the newly elected government and Zardari. But for those of you who know Zardari, Mr. 10%, the word on the street, he has a promotion. He's now Mr. 40%. At least Musharraf had some level of legitimacy on 9/11. After the elections and after being declared president, Zardari doesn't have that legitimacy. So it's questionable whether Zardari can lead Pakistanis to come to a different opinion. So a number of folks actually tell us, for one, myself, another, Lisa Curtis, who unfortunately had to leave a few minutes ago, we've all sort of came upon this sort of equilibrium position that we really have to prosecute if Pakistan is ever to be at peace with itself and with its neighbors. The first thing that we have to do is that we actually have to forge a real working relationship with the Pakistan Army. Now, some of you may say, don't we have that already? We actually don't. What we have is a highly transactional relationship with the Army. We don't sit down, we don't have a strategic dialogue. In fact, I'm amused that the strategic dialogue did not even come into being in 2006. And it's neither strategic nor is it a dialogue. But 2006, I mean, this is really quite astonishing. So we don't have a working relationship with the Army. We have this idea that we pay them for operations that we don't jointly plan and hope they did the right operations. And the evidence is that this program, of course, has been massively abused. But so we have to forge a real working relationship with the Army. And I'm going to tell you right now that this is very difficult to do. I'm not so worried about political Islam in the Pakistan Army. I'm worried about anti-Americanism. And it has nothing to do with us being an unreliable partner. This goes back to the 1965 war. This is an old, accumulating history, and we have to understand that. So these are the challenges of building our relationship with the Pakistan Army. It's not just about money. In fact, all of the money that we've dumped into the Army without any joint planning, without any sort of joint consensus on what the goals are, has actually fostered corruption within that institution. It hasn't fostered good governance or anything. The second task, which is almost as heroic as the first, is that we have to build at the same time, strategically, the institutions that can support democracy in Pakistan. The Army's had 6 decades. We can't say for certain that the civilians are going to do a better job, but there's never been a true democracy in Pakistan. It's always been directly or indirectly overseen and managed by the Army. To give you an example, Kiani made a big splash when he presented a 4-page budget for his army before the Senate. In most countries, that would be expected, not newsworthy. It was all the more risible because the Pakistan Constitution neither permits the Senate nor the National Assembly to change the Pakistan Army budget. So what was the point of that drama? Us here in Washington. So we have to do these two things. Forge a real relationship with an army that, quite frankly, despises us and has become very accustomed to large amounts of money without any accountability. And we also, at the same time, forge a relationship with people who are deeply alienated by our policy. And we don't have the opportunity to let another 10 years go by without making serious movement on both of those fronts. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'll start quickly with Lebanon. It's a great place to meet al-Qaeda-related guys because they're relatively friendly, whereas in Iraq they would have probably cut your head off. And there's been a blowback from Iraq. The surge didn't work in Iraq. It was internal Iraqi dynamics that forced Sunnis to realize they had lost the civil war and forced al-Qaeda to either join the awakening groups or seek shelter in Syria or Lebanon. And we're seeing more and more of a blowback of these guys, the center of gravity shifting towards Syria and Lebanon. Lebanon, being a failed state, is a very convenient location for former fighters. And the first real sign of blowback from Iraq was the fighting in the Nahal Bared camp 2 summers ago in northern Lebanon, where you had mostly foreign, non-Palestinian, Lebanese or Iraqi or Saudi, Algerian, Yemeni, Omani, a lot of them veterans of Iraq. These fighters formed groups throughout the Palestinian camps, but eventually sought shelter in one in the north, taking advantage of basically Lebanon's failed state. Ended up clashing with the army, but there were attempts to instrumentalize them by people very close to the official Sunni establishment in Lebanon, people in fact backed by the US in some cases. In Lebanon, the Hezbollah defeat over Israel in 2006 and Hezbollah's victory in the mini-civil war that we saw last May has done a couple of things. Al-Qaeda is very jealous because who is the only successful army to confront the Israelis? It's Hezbollah, a Shia group that more and more is despised among the Sunni establishment at least. Likewise, Hezbollah, being a powerful movement and military, is making some of the more radical Sunnis feel very nervous. And you hear them calling Hezbollah Hezbollah, Lot being a lot from the Bible, symbolizing sin, or Hezb Shaitan, party of the devil. I met 2 weeks ago with Sheikh Bilal Baroudi, the most important Sunni cleric in northern Lebanon, very close to the future movement, the official Sunni establishment. He told me that Shias are more dangerous than Jews, that Shias are like a cancer or AIDS in the body of the Muslim nation because they're threatening the Sunni Islam from the inside. And this is really a dominant view. He's an establishment figure, and this is what you hear throughout Lebanon these days. Syria and Lebanon are part of Sham, the sort of the more ancient way of referring to this region. And more